I've always loved school events. Maybe because for many years of my life, I didn't have time to appreciate those little moments, those instants that, later, we discovered to be the true treasures of life. So, when my granddaughter called me saying, "Grandma, don't miss my recital, okay?" My heart practically melted. I spent the whole week repeating to myself that nothing would stop me from being there. I prepared my outfit in advance, checked the time twice, set a reminder on my phone, and even prepared dinner earlier, just to avoid the risk of being late. I was anxious, proud, and emotional, like any grandmother who deeply loves that child who brightens her life. When I arrived at the school auditorium, I smelled that familiar scent of old wood mixed with cheap perfume, heard the creaking of chairs, the nervous movement of parents trying to find seats, mothers adjusting dresses at the last minute, and children running around with smeared makeup and huge bows in their hair. It was a delightful chaos, full of life, noise, and anticipation. I sat in the third row, exactly where I knew I could see the stage well. And, of course, my granddaughter. She loved looking at me during the performances. "Grandma, I always find you in the middle of everyone," she would say. And that always made me laugh. While waiting for the recital to begin, I observed the scene around me. A group of parents debating whether they should record horizontally or vertically. A mother crying because her son was growing up too fast. A grandfather showing everyone the drawing his grandson had made of him. I smiled to myself, watching that dance of simple yet so sincere emotions. It was as if everyone there shared the same feeling, the desire to see someone we love shine, even if only for 2, 3, or 5 minutes on stage. And it was in this sweet atmosphere that I felt my heart warm even more. I've always been very close to my granddaughter, perhaps because her arrival filled a silent void I'd carried since my children left home. Being a grandmother gave me back a part of myself I didn't even remember losing, that lighter, more sensitive, more hopeful part. Therefore, that day wasn't just another school event. It was a milestone, a symbol of how beautiful life can be when we see the world through the eyes of someone who is just beginning to discover it. I took a deep breath, adjusted my bag on my lap, and felt my chest swell with pride. My granddaughter had spent weeks rehearsing for this moment. I watched her practice steps on the living room rug, twirl with her hair tied up in a makeshift bun, repeat parts of the song until she was breathless. She wanted to do everything perfectly, not out of vanity, but because she wanted to make me happy. That always moved me. The way she saw love as something to be demonstrated with effort, dedication, and a sparkle in her eyes. So, sitting there, I was exactly where I wanted to be, surrounded by laughter, ambient music, and hushed conversations. Everything seemed light, beautiful, familiar. I felt safe, protected within that childlike universe, as if life, for a few minutes, had given me a break. But at the same time, there was something in the air that I couldn't explain, an almost imperceptible premonition, like a thin, cold thread running down my spine, a silent warning that I ignored because everything was too good to have problems. Little did I know that life loves to turn pages when you least expect it. And that's when, for the first time, that phrase crossed my mind, the phrase I would later repeat to myself for days, weeks, maybe months. I didn't know that in that auditorium, my life would change forever. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't feel it clearly. It was almost like a distant whisper, something hidden amidst the cheerful atmosphere of the place. But looking back, I understand now. The heart always knows before we do. It always perceives the crack before the fall, the tremor before the avalanche, the shadow before the storm. At that moment, however, all I knew was that I was happy, proud, and totally unprepared for what was about to happen. If someone had told me that, in a few minutes, my world would collapse in the middle of that auditorium full of balloons and children covered in glitter, I would have laughed. Never, not even in my worst nightmares, would I have imagined that a simple glance to the side would change not only the rest of my day, but the entire course of my story. But that's how life works, isn't it? The most painful moments don't ask for permission. They simply arrive. If there's one thing that has always fascinated me about school performances, it's the organized chaos that precedes each show. The auditorium seemed to live its own choreography, parents standing and bending down to take photos, cell phones flashing like little stars, mothers adjusting collars and bows, teachers trying to bring order to the mess, and children running between the rows with that irresistible mix of nervousness and excitement. Every detail there made my heart overflow with a kind of warmth that only grandparents understand. a warmth born of pure love, that love that expects nothing in return, except the joy of seeing a piece of their own story shine on stage. From where I was sitting, I could see part of the stage curtains swaying. Behind them, I knew my granddaughter was there, trying to control her breathing, perhaps mentally rehearsing the choreography. Steps. She had always been a perfectionist, but not out of pride or insecurity. It was out of a deep desire to do well for those she loved. And she always said that the first person she wanted to make proud was me. That was the kind of thing that affected me in a way I could never explain. The characteristic smell of the place, old wood, fine dust accumulated backstage, and that hairspray perfume that the teachers used so generously, brought back old memories of when I watched my own children in similar performances. And now, so many years later, I was there again, experiencing it all anew, but with an infinitely greater meaning. Because being a grandmother is different. It's like reliving motherhood, but with more calm, more sweetness, and more awareness of the importance of each small moment. I spent a few minutes watching the other children getting ready. Some had trembling hands, others laughed loudly to disguise their nervousness. A small boy, with his hair full of gel, awkwardly, repeated a step in the side aisle, tripping over his own feet while his mother filmed him with a huge smile. A girl squeezed her pink tutu so tightly it seemed like she was going to squeeze her nervousness out. All of this created an almost magical atmosphere, full of expectation and hope. And amidst this sweet whirlwind, my gaze constantly searched for a single face. Hers, my granddaughter. That girl who brought light to dark corners of my life, who made me believe again in the beauty of small things, who taught me, at only 7 years old, that love can be simple and profound at the same time. I knew she was there behind the curtains, perhaps biting her lower lip, perhaps adjusting her hair ribbon for the 10th time, perhaps searching for my place with her eyes. When the curtain finally opened a little, and I caught a glimpse of her, it was as if the whole world had paused. She looked beautiful, in her light blue dress, subtly shimmering, her hair neatly styled in a bun, her cheeks slightly flushed with nervousness, and that determined look that always made me feel proud. She didn't see me right away, but I saw her, and that sight, just that, would have been worth the whole day. My chest swelled with such immense pride it almost hurt. It's curious how love can occupy so much space inside us without ever truly overflowing. It just expands, 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 and in that instant I felt that if I could freeze a moment in my life, it would be that one, before the chaos, before the pain, before the world turned upside down. As the background music began to play softly, some parents raised their cell phones, others adjusted themselves in their seats, and I simply breathed deeply, absorbing every detail. The principal's voice echoed through the microphone, asking for silence, but no one seemed to hear very well, except the children, who lined up with their shoulders pressed together, trying not to show the panic etched in their eyes. I smiled tenderly, imagining how my granddaughter would be coping with all of this. She had always been very sensitive, but also incredibly strong, a rare, precious combination. I knew that when she stepped onto the stage, all the anxiety would transform into lightness, as always happened when she danced. It was as if the world became too small to contain so much will to live, and everything was perfect. So perfect that my heart seemed to be in complete harmony with the atmosphere. Everything was joy, anticipation, affection, hope. Those soft stage lights created a golden glow that made everything even more beautiful. I felt with absolute certainty that this would be an unforgettable afternoon, but not in the way I expected, because while I was absorbing all that good energy, while my heart was preparing to see my granddaughter fulfill her dream of shining on stage, something was approaching, something silent, unexpected, almost invisible, ready to shatter everything. The feeling began as a thread of anxiety in my stomach, too small to bother me, large enough to be noticed. A slight pang that something wasn't quite right. I didn't pay attention. How could I? Life was perfect there, just the way I wanted it. My granddaughter was about to enter. My husband was supposedly already somewhere in the auditorium, looking for a good place to film. And I was there, with my heart full, ready to experience another one of those moments we cherish forever. Everything seemed perfect, until it isn't. I've always had a habit of looking for my husband at family events, not out of necessity, but reflexively. After so many years together, my gaze automatically sought his during special moments, as if every celebration had to pass through the filter of our shared gaze, as if every joy was only complete when I saw his discreet smile approving everything. It had been like that since we met, and I never imagined that, on that very day, this innocent habit would be responsible for breaking my heart in two, as the first. Groups of children positioned themselves behind the stage. I scanned the audience, trying to find where he was sitting. I knew he came straight from work, and that he would probably be further back in the auditorium, where it would be easy to reach him without disturbing anyone. He was always punctual, but he was also always present, even when tired, even when life's obligations pulled him in all directions. That's why I didn't even consider the possibility of him not being there. For me, his presence was as guaranteed as the stage lights beginning to come on. I shifted my gaze from the children to the rows of chairs, first the left side, then the central section. I wasn't in a hurry, but something inside me told me that finding him would bring a special comfort, as it always had, and it was then, exactly when my eyes reached the seventh row on the right, that my whole body froze. There he was, my husband, but he was not alone. The first thing I felt wasn't anger, nor sadness. It was confusion. A confusion so profound, so silent, so absurd, that for a second I thought I was misinterpreting the scene. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe my eyes were being deceived by the distance, the lighting, the nervousness of the moment. But as my eyes adjusted their focus, like a camera lens that automatically positions itself to reveal the cruel truth that was hidden, I realized there was no mistake at all. It was him, and she. The emotional camera of the moment seemed to zoom in on the scene in slow motion, as if the universe wanted to make sure I saw every detail, every gesture, every feature of that image that would soon become an open wound. My heart began to pound, not in my chest, but in my hands, my neck, my head. It was as if every part of my body had heard the warning even before I understood what was happening. She was sitting next to him, very close, too close to be just an acquaintance, a distant friend, someone who happened to be sitting there. No, it was a kind of intimate, comfortable, familiar closeness, a kind of closeness that shouldn't exist, a kind of closeness that hurts just to look at. She turned her face slightly toward him and smiled, a small smile but full of intention, a smile that didn't belong there, a smile that wasn't meant to be there. And my husband smiled back, not with a full smile, but with that look of complicity that I knew so well. That look he gave when he was too comfortable with someone, when something already existed, a history, an intimacy, a connection. I felt my hands trembling on top of the bag. My body tried to hide it, to remain still, but inside me everything was collapsing like a building without a frame. My breath became short, as if the air around me had been sucked away by an invisible vacuum cleaner. I tried to blink a few times, thinking that maybe the world would return to normal when I opened my eyes again, but it didn't. Nothing returned. The feeling was so overwhelming that, for a moment, I forgot where I was. I forgot the people around me, the lights, the children on stage, the cheerful noise that had previously calmed me. Everything seemed to blur, except for the two of them. They were the only clear point in the middle of a suddenly distorted universe. It was as if the stage had ceased to exist, and the entire auditorium was in absolute silence, watching along with me the most painful discovery of my life. I searched for some logical explanation. Maybe it was someone he knew from work. Maybe it was someone he met there by chance. Maybe. But deep down, I knew. A woman's intuition is never wrong, especially the intuition of someone who has shared decades of life with someone. The body knows before the mind. The heart screams before the mouth. And mine screamed so loudly that I could almost hear it echoing between the auditorium seats. And, as if that weren't enough, a small but deadly detail destroyed any hope of normalcy. She placed her hand on his arm, a light, soft, intimate hand, like someone who has freedom, like someone who has permission, like someone who has a history. And he didn't walk away. At that moment, I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. My stomach churned so violently that I felt like I was going to faint right there. The world became too heavy, too dark, too cruel, and all of this happened without anyone around me noticing. It's astonishing. How is it possible for the world to continue as normal when yours ends? How can people keep laughing, taking pictures, adjusting dresses, while your heart is being ripped open in the middle of a brightly lit auditorium? I forced myself to look at the stage, but my eyes kept returning to him, to the two of them. It was as if my body was torn between what I wanted to do and what I needed to face. And while this silent battle raged within me, a terrible certainty settled in my chest. That woman shouldn't have been there. Not beside him, not that day, not like that. The recital hadn't even started, and I already knew, even without understanding all the details, that nothing would be the same after that moment. That look, that instant frozen in pain and disbelief, would be the beginning of a storm that would sweep everything away. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was an almost instinctive panic, as if my body had sensed the danger even before my mind had identified what was happening. My hands suddenly began to sweat, slippery, as if I were holding water. My fingers trembled slightly, and no matter how hard I tried to close them, locking them on the bag strap, the trembling seemed to gain strength of its own. It was a silent sign that something terrible had been triggered inside me, something I wouldn't be able to stop. My heart raced so fast it felt like it was pounding in my neck, my face, even my temples. It was as if each beat came with a warning, a desperate inner scream. You know that feeling of freefall? When your stomach rises, your chest tightens, and everything seems to collapse inside? That's exactly what I felt, an invisible fall within me, long, deep, cruel. My breath became short, as if the air around me had become too thick to pass through my throat. I had to control the urge to get up, to run outside, to seek any kind of refuge, any quiet corner where I could understand what I was about to face. But I remained there, motionless, trying to breathe slowly, trying to convince my body that there was still time to understand before feeling too much. But there wasn't one, because even unintentionally my eyes were once again fixed on that row, on that exact spot in the auditorium, on those two faces. I knew I was about to see something that would change my life, but still, it was as if an invisible force was pulling me back to that scene, forcing me to look even when every part of me was begging me to close my eyes. I took a deep breath. I forced myself to maintain a steady gaze, even though inside I was crumbling. And it was then that I realized, with painful clarity, who was sitting next to him. She was a woman, not just any woman, not someone who just happened to take the empty seat next to my husband. No, that woman was too intimate, too comfortable, too close. Her body leaned slightly toward him, as if she had been there for a while, as if she were certain that this was her place. The way she crossed her legs, how she adjusted her hair, how she smiled discreetly while talking to him. None of it was strange, awkward, or shy. It was natural, unabashedly natural, and that's what struck me the most. The naturalness, the complete absence of embarrassment, familiarity. Because intimacy isn't always shown through hugs or kisses. It's revealed in the details, in the comfort, in the way two people share the same space without hesitation. And what I saw there, in that auditorium full of children and distracted parents, was exactly that, comfort. A kind of silent complicity that only exists between two people who share something beyond words. My heart, already racing, gave a painful leap in my chest when I noticed the next movement. She placed her hand on his arm. It wasn't a casual touch, one of those that happen unintentionally when someone shifts in their chair. It was a conscious touch, delicate, slow, familiar, like someone holding something they believe belongs to them. She touched the tips of her fingers to his forearm and gave him a light caress, almost imperceptible to any distracted observer, but impossible for me to ignore. A small touch, but full of meaning. A touch that spoke louder than any word. And my husband not only accepted that touch, he reacted. He tilted his head slightly toward hers, as if listening better to someone who mattered. And then, the final blow came. He smiled. Not a wide, obvious, exaggerated smile, but that restrained, discreet smile that I knew so well. A smile I saw in Yao. Moments when he felt comfortable, welcomed, admired. A deep, intimate smile. A smile I had seen so many times, but never imagined seeing directed at another person. Never. That smile pierced me like a cold blade. My stomach churned, as if I'd swallowed an enormous, indigestible weight. My throat burned, and my eyes began to sting. But I didn't cry. Not at that moment. I was too paralyzed for that. It was as if the world had shrunk around them, as if everything had faded into the background. The stage, the lights, the children, the conversations, while the image of the two of them together became ever clearer, more cruel, more impossible to ignore. I tried to look away. I swear I tried. But it was as if my mind, in a desperate instinct for self-protection, wanted to capture every detail, perhaps searching for some explanation, some sign that I was interpreting everything wrong. But there was no mistake. There was no misunderstanding. There was no innocence in that scene. She was playing. He was smiling, and the world I knew began to melt before my eyes. The feeling of betrayal began to form inside me like a rough stone, scraping from within, hurting every piece it encountered. It was strange. At no point had I heard words, seen messages, witnessed anything concrete, but that gesture, that touch, that smile, that was evidence enough. It was the kind of truth that doesn't need to be spoken. It simply exists. Raw, cold, fatal. I took another deep breath, this time feeling the air scratch my lungs. And in that instant, in that exact second, I knew that nothing, absolutely nothing about my marriage would ever be the same after that recital. The exact moment I realized what was happening, my body simply stopped. I couldn't move, speak, or even blink for a few seconds. It was as if I had been ripped from my own body and placed there, in the third row, like a spectator of my own life crumbling. The world no longer seemed real. I looked at the stage, but I couldn't see anything. The sound around me seemed distant, as if I were underwater, and for a few moments, the only thing that existed was the suffocating emptiness inside my chest. I froze in my chair, not because I didn't want to react, but because I couldn't. My brain was working frantically, trying to comprehend the scene, while my heart, completely shattered, struggled to keep up the pace. I felt a kind of numbness take over my body, starting from my feet and slowly rising, like an icy wave that paralyzes, overwhelms, and numbs. It was as if my own system was trying to anesthetize me to prevent me from falling apart right there, in front of everyone. Sitting in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by laughter, cell phone flashes, and children adjusting their costumes, I felt like the loneliest person in the world. And there was something even worse than the pain of suspected infidelity. The silent humiliation, the terrible feeling of being deceived in public, of being the last to see what perhaps other people had already noticed, of living, without any choice, the kind of scene that nobody wants for themselves. It was a kind of shame that didn't stem from something I did, but from what was happening to me, without me being able to stop it. And that feeling hurt as much as the wound of betrayal itself. I tried to understand. I tried to find explanations, excuses, any minimal possibility that wouldn't destroy me inside. But everything seemed so clear, so definitive, so cruel. The way she touched his arm, his smile, their posture, the comfort, the intimacy, the naturalness. None of it was accidental. None of it was innocent. With each passing second, the air around me seemed to grow heavier. I took several deep breaths, or at least tried to. But the oxygen seemed not to reach me. My breathing turned into small, silent sobs, almost imperceptible, but extremely painful. It was as if I had forgotten how to breathe, as if my body had lost its most basic function simply because it was unable to cope. And while I struggled for the calm that wouldn't come, the people around me continued living their own lives. A mother to my left adjusted her daughter's hair tie. A father in the front row raised his cell phone to photograph something on stage. 2 teenage girls giggled softly while watching videos on their phones. Everything so normal, everything so ordinary, everything so cruelly indifferent to my pain. That's when I realized the magnitude of the shock. The world didn't stop when mine collapsed, and that hurt more than I expected. The feeling of betrayal burned inside, but the public humiliation, even though no one knew what was happening, made it all unbearable. It was as if everyone was watching my life fall apart, even if no one was really aware of it. I felt exposed, vulnerable, broken, like an old photograph torn in half, still trying to maintain its original shape, but already irreversibly damaged. I remembered the times I sat next to my husband at these same kinds of events. We would whisper, hold hands, laugh at the most awkward presentations. And now, seeing someone occupy that seat next to him, that seat that has always been mine, was like a slow stab, a wound that doesn't bleed on the outside, but opens gaping holes on the inside. And worse than seeing it was feeling it. To feel that perhaps I had been living a lie for much longer than I imagined. To feel that the smile he gave her had been rehearsed before. To feel that complicity perhaps wasn't recent. The pain came in waves, like a cruel tide crashing against the same spot, always, 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 until it hurt so much that it became impossible to distinguish sadness from shock, anger from despair, pain from disbelief. I was there, but I wasn't anymore. The stage lights began to change, announcing that the next performance was about to begin. People adjusted their postures, fell silent, and prepared to watch. But I could no longer be a part of that moment. What should have been one of the most special days for my granddaughter was turning into a scene of emotional destruction for me. And then, the brutal truth took shape within me. A short, simple, devastating sentence. At that moment, I was no longer in the recital. I was trying to breathe, and that was exactly it. I was no longer living in the present. I could no longer see the stage. I wasn't listening to the music anymore. I wasn't there anymore. I was trying not to fall apart, trying not to cry, trying not to run away, desperately trying not to feel everything at once. The recital continued, but my life had come to a standstill. When they announced the next performance and I heard my granddaughter's name echoing through the microphone, my whole body reacted before my mind. An automatic impulse made me straighten my posture, grip my bag tighter, and try to compose my face. I knew that, in a few seconds, she would walk onto that stage looking for me in the audience. And, however broken I was inside, I couldn't bear the thought of her seeing me crumble at the very moment she had been waiting for. The lights dimmed slightly, the focus shifted to the center of the stage, and then, there she was. My granddaughter walked in with small steps, counting mentally to the rhythm of the music that was beginning to play. Her light blue dress seemed to shine even brighter in the light, and her tight bun left her face completely exposed. So innocent, so focused, so full of hope. She wasn't just another child in a school performance. To me, she was the center of the universe at that moment. Or at least, she should have been. I forced a smile. Not one of those broad, spontaneous smiles that always came naturally when I saw her. It was a fragile, tense, almost rehearsed smile, like someone trying to convince the world, and themselves, that everything was all right. My eyes filled with tears, but I blinked rapidly, several times, fighting back the sobs that threatened to escape. It wasn't the time for this. It couldn't be. She positioned herself in the marked spot on the stage floor, glanced quickly at the audience, and for a brief second our eyes met. It was quick, but intense. And in that look, I saw everything I needed to remember, the reason why I still needed to remain whole. She gave a small, almost nervous smile as if silently asking, "Can you see me, Grandma?" And I gave a discreet nod as if answering, "I'm here, my love. I'm here." On the outside, I was the present, proud, and emotional grandmother. Inside, I was a burning building trying to pretend it was still a home. The music began softly, and she took her first turn. The steps I had seen dozens of times in my living room now took on a special brilliance there, before everyone. Each movement was delicate, studied, full of care. I knew how much she had dedicated herself. He knew how many times she had stumbled, made mistakes, started again, and persisted. All of that was there, in that moment, in the way she raised her arms, how she balanced on the tips of her toes, how she tilted her face to the side with the grace of someone born for the stage. And I wanted to be fully present there. I wanted my heart to be full, free, and happy. I wanted the only emotion inside me to be pride, but it wasn't. While my granddaughter danced, my eyes tried to remain fixed on her, but the pain was so great that it seemed to pull my gaze back to where I no longer wanted to look. I knew that a few meters away from me, my husband was still sitting with that woman beside him, perhaps commenting on the performance, perhaps smiling, perhaps not even imagining that I had seen. I made an almost superhuman effort not to look back, not to seek confirmation with my eyes of what was already obvious. I forced myself to stay focused on the stage, to breathe deeply, to cling to that dance as if it were the only thing capable of preventing me from collapsing completely. But every second was torture. As she spun gently, I spun inside in a whirlwind of thoughts. How long has this been going on? Am I the last to know? How many times has he been right next to her while I thought he was doing something else? Does she know about me? Does she know about our family? Does she know about our granddaughter? And the cruelest blow. Could it be that even knowing this, she agreed to be there? Guilt began to mingle with the pain. Guilt for being there devastated, while my granddaughter gave her all on stage. Guilt for not being able to fully immerse myself in the moment she had dreamed of. Guilt for, instead of thinking only of her, having my mind torn between pride and devastation. I pressed my hands together, as if this silent gesture could squeeze out the anguish and make it flow through my fingers. A part of me wanted to get up, leave, escape that place, go to the bathroom, cry silently, look in the mirror and try to understand who I was in this new world, opening up before me, a world in which my husband was no longer just my husband, but someone who hid secrets. But I didn't get up. I stayed for her, because even in pieces I knew that, for my granddaughter, that moment was unique. She wouldn't remember who was sitting next to whom. She wouldn't remember details of the audience, nor the expressions of the adults. She would remember only one thing: if I was there, if I saw her dance, if I clapped when she finished. So I stayed. The building looks nice on the outside, but is falling apart on the inside. The applause began to echo as she finished the first part of the choreography. My eyes burned, and I clapped mechanically, trying not to fall apart. She smiled again toward the audience, perhaps trying to find me again, and I leaned forward slightly, as if that would help make me more visible to her. I wanted her to be certain of one thing amidst that crowd. Regardless of what was happening between the adults, her love was safe with me. She continued dancing, each step more beautiful than the last. The other parents sighed, made comments, recorded videos, and I found myself thinking about how that video, if I filmed it, would forever be etched in my memory as the day everything broke. I didn't have the courage to pick up my phone. I felt that if I tried to film, my trembling hands would betray what I was feeling, so I did the only thing I could still do. I looked at her as if it were the last time I would see something so pure, and that's precisely why it hurt even more. Because while she twirled lightly, innocently, freely, my heart felt burdened with tons of secrets, lies, doubts, and memories that suddenly became questionable. Life had been divided into two periods: before seeing them together, and after that look. And I was there, exactly in the middle of that line, trying to hold it all together with my bare hands. At a certain point, while the music reached its most beautiful point, and she was performing the most delicate turn in the choreography, a question arose within me with such force that it felt like a silent scream. How could something so beautiful happen while my life was falling apart? And that was the great contradiction of that moment. The stage was sparkling. My granddaughter was smiling. The steps were perfect. The costume was impeccable. The audience was charmed. And me? I was sitting in the dark, watching, at the same time, the most beautiful and the most devastating scene of my life. When the music finally ended and she struck her last pose, the auditorium erupted in applause. I clapped with all my might, not just for the performance, but for her, for the child who was innocent, who knew nothing, who only wanted to show her grandmother how hard she had tried. And for a second, I almost forgot the pain. Almost. She bowed along with the other children, looked at the audience one more time, and trying to find me, gave a shy wave. I raised my hand and waved back, my chest tight, struggling to ensure that, from where she was, all she saw was love. Because the truth is, even if my world were falling apart, that dance was still her dream, and I wouldn't allow an adult's lie to steal the beauty of a child's moment. At least at that moment, I could still choose that. When the show ended and the auditorium began to slowly empty, I knew that this would be the most difficult moment of all. Not because I didn't know how to confront him. After all, after decades of marriage, we'd learned to handle difficult conversations, but because this time, the conversation wouldn't just be difficult, it would be definitive. It would be the breaking point between what I believed to be the truth and what I now needed to accept as reality. The audience gradually dispersed. Parents crowded in front of the stage to fetch their children, take photos, hug them, congratulate them. Teachers adjusted the curtains, collected forgotten objects, and gave hurried instructions. Children ran into their mother's arms, still breathless from the exertion of the performance, carrying lollipops and drawings. It was a sweet, chaotic, and happy mess, but I wasn't part of it. To me, it all seemed distant, blurred, as if an invisible wall separated me from the world. I remained seated for a few minutes, gripping the bag tightly enough to leave marks on the leather. I didn't want to get up while there were too many people around. I didn't want to show my pain. I also didn't want to risk someone asking me something trivial, like, "Did you enjoy the presentation?" and me breaking down right there. I needed to wait for the place to empty out. I needed to regain some strength before doing what needed to be done. Gradually, the auditorium grew quieter. Little by little, my granddaughter was led by her parents to the hallway to take pictures. She was still looking for me, but I made a subtle gesture, asking for a little time. She didn't understand, but smiled. Anyway, children don't recognize adult pain, and that's a good thing. May she maintain this purity for as long as possible. Once most people had left, I slowly stood up. My legs felt weak, as if they hadn't yet understood that I needed them at that moment. I took a deep breath, adjusted my coat, discreetly wiped the corner of my eyes, and walked toward the side exit of the auditorium, where I knew he would be. My husband was always predictable. He liked to wait in the quietest corners, away from, say, the commotion, until the activity subsided. And of course, she would be there too. Each step I took seemed heavier than the last. It was like walking through dense, cold water that pulled me down, trying to stop me from continuing. But I kept going, because however painful it was, I needed the truth. Not the truth one can guess at with glances, but the truth spoken, confronted, faced. When I turned the corner, I saw him immediately. My husband stood there by the door, hands in his pockets, trying to appear natural, but his posture was far too giving him away. He looked around repeatedly, like someone afraid of being seen, and beside him, of course, was her, the woman who shouldn't have been there, the woman who had stolen the spotlight from the recital, who had turned a special day into an emotional minefield. And right at that moment, when my eyes met hers, she realized I was approaching. The reaction was instantaneous. She tried to leave, not abruptly, but in a studied way, discreetly, calculated, like someone who knows exactly what they're doing, like someone who wanted to avoid confrontation. As someone who, above all, I knew who I was. She quickly looked away, pretended to fiddle with her phone, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and started walking toward the opposite aisle. But I wasn't frozen anymore. I wasn't paralyzed anymore. And, despite the trembling in my hands and the tightness in my chest, I was very aware of every movement around me. I called my husband by his name. The voice came out low, firm, yet laden with something he recognized immediately: pain. He turned with a start, as if he had been waiting for this moment, but at the same time desperately wishing it wouldn't come. "Can we talk?" I said, without raising my voice, without crying, without trembling. The forced calmness I displayed seemed to make him even more nervous, and it was at that exact moment that the woman turned her face and unintentionally revealed a part of her identity, a part that made my stomach churn in a way I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I recognized her, not completely immediately, but enough to feel the shock run down my spine. She wasn't a stranger, far from it. There was something in the way she walked, the shape of her eyes, the way she avoided direct eye contact, that stirred old memories, a shadow of the past, an echo of what one day was part of my life, or his. My husband realized from my fixed gaze that I had recognized the woman, and at that instant, his expression changed, from surprise to fear, from fear to guilt, and from guilt to an overwhelming silence, the kind of silence that reveals more than any verbal confession. "Aren't you going to introduce me?" I asked, in a firm voice that I barely recognized as my own. The woman swallowed hard, almost tripping over her own feet as she tried to walk away. She didn't answer, didn't explain herself, didn't apologize. She simply turned her face away, as if her very presence was a guilt she dared not confront. And it was there, in that narrow, dimly lit hallway, after my granddaughter's dance recital, that the story's main hook was revealed for the first time, not with words, but with their reactions. She was not a stranger, and they both knew it. They both knew I would remember. They both knew that this would change everything, and I, for the first time that afternoon, was absolutely certain that I was facing a truth far greater than a simple betrayal. Something deeper, older, more dangerous. The story was just beginning. I stood there, frozen in that hallway, staring at her like someone confronting a ghost returned to collect a debt you didn't even know existed. Time seemed to slow down. The voices in the background faded away. And for a few seconds, all that existed was the woman's face trying to escape, my husband's gaze avoiding mine, and the overwhelming feeling that I was about to revisit an old chapter of my life that I thought was already closed. Because she was not a stranger. I knew who she was. And that made everything infinitely worse. Her name came to my mind like a distant yet clear echo. Carla. Years ago, she had been much more than just an acquaintance. For a period of our lives, Carla was someone who came into our home, sat at our table, shared confidences with me, asked for advice, and received help. She wasn't just a random presence. At one point, she was almost a part of the family. And the cruelest thing of all was remembering that when she needed it most, it was us, my husband and I, who opened our doors, our hearts, our wallets, and even the time we didn't have to help her. I remember exactly the first time I saw her. She was fragile, going through financial and emotional difficulties. She had left an abusive relationship, struggling to start over, trying to piece her own story back together. I welcomed her as one welcomes someone wounded on the side of the road. I made coffee, listened to her troubles, offered her a shoulder to cry on, prayers, and advice. My husband, in turn, helped with job contacts, suggested opportunities, and gave her rides when she didn't have money for transportation. The two of us reached out to her together. And now, years later, she was there, by his side, at our granddaughter's recital, as if she had every right to occupy that place. I felt a mixture of nausea and indignation rising within me. It wasn't just marital betrayal, it was a betrayal of trust, of gratitude, of shared history. It was as if someone had taken all the gestures of kindness we offered and used them as stepping stones to climb to the point of stabbing us from above. "Carla," I finally said, letting out the name that had been burning in my throat. She stopped. Her body froze mid-step. It was impossible to pretend I hadn't heard. Slowly, as if she knew there was no point in running anymore, she turned around. Her eyes, which had previously avoided me, now met mine, not with courage, but with that heavy mixture of guilt and resignation. "Hi," she murmured, almost in a whisper, as if the word was having difficulty coming out. Her hi wasn't a greeting. It was an admission. It was almost a, "Yes, it's me." My husband remained silent, and, to me, his silence spoke louder than any justification. He didn't try to disguise it, didn't try to invent a quick story. He simply looked from one to the other, like a guilty man caught red-handed who no longer has room for simple lies. A whirlwind of memories began to pass through my head. I remembered the afternoons when she sat on my couch, crying about life's difficulties. I remembered the times I told her, "Calm down, God will open a door." I remembered how I defended her when other people judged her. I remembered when my husband suggested, "Let's see if I can find something for her at the company, even if it's temporary." And I remembered the moment when, little by little, our time together diminished. She stopped showing up. She stopped texting. She stopped asking for help. At the time, I thought it was a good thing, that life was finally getting back on track for her. It never crossed my mind that perhaps she had changed doors, leaving mine and entering the one that was now next to my husband's. "You remember her, don't you?" my husband finally said, his voice low, trying to sound neutral, but his nervousness betrayed every syllable. I looked at him with a calmness that didn't match the hurricane inside me. "I remember everything," I replied. And it was true. I remembered, perhaps more than they would have liked. Carla took a deep breath, as if finally accepting that there was no way around the situation anymore. "I didn't want it to be like this," she began. I raised my hand, interrupting. "Don't say you didn't want to," I said firmly, "because nobody accidentally ends up sitting next to another woman's husband at a family recital." She swallowed hard, without replying. That scene had an emotional weight that no film could reproduce. It wasn't just the discovery of another woman. It was the discovery of who that woman was. Someone who knew our story. Someone who knew about our family. Someone who had already heard, from my own lips, how much I valued my marriage, my grandchildren, my home. And even so, she chose to be there. The intensity of the pain grew because the story wasn't simple. She wasn't a stranger who appeared in his life. No, he was someone who walked alongside us, for a while. Someone who received help, who entered our intimacy, who saw firsthand the kind of bond we had, or that I believed we had. Therefore, when I looked at her, I didn't just see the other woman. I could see the woman who sat at the table with me, cried with me, and listened to my advice. I saw the cruel irony of having unknowingly helped build the bridge she crossed to get to my wedding. And there, in that hallway, a painful realization hit her. The betrayal hadn't just come from within the home. It had also been fueled by someone I once considered close. This gave everything a darker, denser depth. It wasn't a story of a slip-up. It was a story of repeated choices, of hidden encounters, of a coexistence built in the shadow of everything I believed to be solid. I looked at the two of them, feeling my throat burn. "Do you really think this started when?" I asked, more to myself than to them. You know what's worse? I don't know what hurts more, finding out my husband cheated on me, or finding out that a woman I once helped, whom I took in, thought I deserved this. Carla lowered her face. My husband closed his eyes for a moment, as if he wanted to disappear into himself. Neither of them had an answer that could lessen the damage. And perhaps that was the main point. There was no justification that would make it tolerable. And it was then, amidst all that pain, that one thing became very clear to me. The story I was living wasn't about just any betrayal, it was about ingratitude. It was about disrespect. It was about someone close who crossed the line. And this, however paradoxical it may seem, did not make me any weaker. It made me more aware. From that moment on, I was no longer just hurt. I was awake. And that would change everything from now on. The hallway was almost empty when my husband finally realized there was no escape. He was cornered, not by walls, but by his own conscience. I could see it in the way he breathed, his lips pressed together, his hands fidgeting, his avoidance of direct eye contact. He had always been a man of few words, but at that moment, his silence spoke louder than any prepared speech. It was the silence of someone who knew the truth had reached its limit. I stood there, firm, while inside a silent earthquake shook everything. Funny how sometimes strength appears in the moments when we least expect it. I wasn't trembling anymore. I wasn't crying. I wasn't raising my voice. It was a strange, almost dangerous calm, the kind that comes when the pain has already surpassed any emotional limit, when there's no room left for outrage, only for reality. My husband swallowed hard and finally opened his mouth. I can explain, he said, and the sentence came out so weak, so broken, that it seemed to have been pushed out, not spoken. Then explain, I replied, without raising my voice, because I'm listening. He looked around, as if searching for a place to hide, or someone who could save him from that conversation. But there was no one. It was just the three of us, me, him, and the woman who had been intimate enough to sit next to him at a family recital, intimate enough to touch his arm, intimate enough to try to run away when she saw me. He took a deep breath, but his breath came out shaky. It's not what you're thinking, he began. I almost laughed. Almost. But I didn't give him that benefit. And what am I thinking? I asked calmly. Because honestly, I'd like to know which version you think I saw there. He looked away again. It was amazing how guilt makes someone shrink, how the whole body changes. Shoulders slump, posture falters, face changes color, gaze averts as if afraid to face one's own reflection. He seemed smaller than I remembered, smaller than the man I married, smaller than the grandfather who took so many pictures with our granddaughter. Carla contacted me a few months ago, he began, his words coming out slowly, carefully chosen. She was going through some difficulties. I interrupted him with a subtle movement of my hand. Don't come to me with difficulties. Everyone goes through difficulties in life. I want to know about the part where you decided to help, alone, and secretly from me. He closed his eyes for a second, just a second, but that gesture was revealing. It was the kind of micro-confession only someone carrying a heavy truth makes, that closing of the eyes that says, I know I'm wrong, I just don't know how to fix it. I just wanted to help, he whispered. Helping? I repeated. Sitting next to her at our granddaughter's recital? Helping how? Giving emotional support? Or was it another kind of support? The question hit him like a direct blow. He tried to react, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth opened and closed, like someone trying to breathe in a place without air. Nothing happened between us, he insisted. Then why did she run away when she saw me? I asked. Silence. Why didn't you remove her hand? From your arm? Silence. Why did you smile at her like that? More silence. With each question I asked, the wall around him closed in a little more. He had nowhere left to run. I no longer had any edited version of the story to offer, because the truth was right there, stamped on what he didn't say, not on what he tried to explain. Carla remained quiet, leaning against the wall, staring at her own hands. She knew that any words she said would only worsen the situation, and, in a way, I preferred it that way. I didn't want to hear her voice trying to participate in an explanation that was never hers to give. My husband tried. He really tried. I only approached her because I thought, he murmured, stuttering so much that it seemed the syllables were slipping from his tongue. What did you think? I asked. He finally lifted his face and looked at me, and it was as if, in that look, something opened up. Not an answer, not a complete confession, but a beginning, a crack, big enough to let the truth seep out. I don't know when things got out of control, he said. And that sentence, this phrase, it fell on me like an invisible punch, because she was carrying an admission, not of actions, but of intention, not through gestures, but through feeling. And that somehow hurt even more. He kept trying to explain, but nothing that came out made sense. The words were empty, confused, a mixture of justification and poorly formulated regret, and each poorly constructed. Sentence increased the feeling that what I had seen there in the auditorium was only the tip of a much deeper emotional iceberg. My mind, while he stammered, worked on its own. This didn't start today. It wasn't the first time they had met. There's something he's not saying. There's more to the story than that. Carla's presence wasn't the beginning. It was the symptom, the result, the consequence of something that had been silently forming, and that's what gave that moment a brutal suspense. It wasn't just physical betrayal that I feared. It was emotional betrayal, a slow, cultivated betrayal. The betrayal that begins with hidden conversations, deleted messages, casual encounters that cease to be casual. And as I watched him stumble over his own words, I realized something very clear. He wasn't trying to explain the truth to me. He was trying to choose which part of the truth would hurt less, but no part of it would hurt lightly. I took a deep breath, feeling the air burn in my lungs. "You're not telling me everything," I said. His eyes widened. I'm trying— No, I interrupted firmly. "You're trying to give me a controlled version, a watered-down version. But I know you, and I know when the conversation is bigger than what's being said." And it was. I could feel it in my own skin, in the heart. My intuition, from the beginning of that afternoon, had been warning me that I was facing something enormous, bigger than my wedding, bigger than the recital, bigger than that woman leaning against the wall. Carla finally lifted her face, and her gaze met mine, for the first time, without running away. And there was something in that look that made me shudder, something that wasn't their fault. It wasn't fear. It was a shame, as if she knew something I didn't yet know, as if the whole truth were so devastating that even she didn't have the courage to say it. And it was there, in that moment of heavy silence, that I realized I wasn't just discovering a betrayal. I was about to uncover a hidden story, a story that would shatter everything I believed to be true. The audience watching this story knows. The suspense isn't in what has already been revealed. It's in what's yet to come. And I knew that too. Profoundly, instinctively, irremediably. That night's conversation wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the revelation. And the truth, the real truth, was still waiting to be revealed. I just had no idea how far she would go.